Hi everybody, my name is Timnit Gebru, and Emily Denton and I are organizing this tutorial on fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And so we broke it up into 3 parts, and this part is on data ethics. So I'll do the first half of the lecture, which is 30 minutes, and then Emily will do the latter half. For those of you who are watching this as part of the workshop, this was the keynote I was planning on giving anyways, and so I decided to use this for the same recording. But if you are able to also watch our tutorial, we more extensively talk about fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics in computer vision in our tutorial. Okay, so many issues in fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics are rooted in decisions surrounding the data collection, annotation, and ownership practices. In the first part of this tutorial, I gave a bunch of examples, but I'll recap them really quickly. For example, I gave this example of from Datasheets, which is work by Joy Bewamini and I, showing the high disparities in error rates among gender classification systems. So these are systems that take a picture of a person in them, and they try to classify the picture as containing a male or a female binary. And we found that the darker and darker the skin tone, the higher and higher the error rates, and the highest disparities in error rates are between lighter skinned men and darker skinned women. So here you see for Face++ and IBM, you reach almost random chance the darker and darker the skin tone. And so many companies responded to this work by releasing new data sets, like IBM, for example, and Microsoft also changed their APIs so that it doesn't have this kind of disparity anymore. Amazon may be audited, and there were a few changes in laws as well. But I think I tried to raise the complexity of doing this because, for example, IBM had to take down diversity in faces because many of us use Flickr in computer vision, but we have to understand that when people put their images out on Flickr, they're not necessarily imagining that it'll be used in face recognition products. And I try to describe the fact that even though Microsoft said that they have low disparities in error rates anymore, this task of gender recognition should not really even exist because many people, especially in the trans community, have written about the harms of this kind of classification. So this is actually a task that shouldn't even exist. And then, of course, at Google, they took into the heart the fact that we have to make sure that everything works for darker skinned people as well. But then the way they were doing this was trying to collect more images of people from darker skinned, and this was done the news reported that this was done in a predatory manner. And even the governmental agency NIST whose job is to evaluate these kinds of systems for accuracy, have been using data from the most vulnerable groups of people. And I think Emily's going to talk about categorization later, but this talk, Counting the Countless, is one of many other talks that talks about just the harms in classifying people in general, because many of the people at the margins, many of the people for whom these classifications have not worked, are always going to be harmed by a classification system. And so I suggest you read a book called Sorting Things Out, or this talk, Counting the Countless, to understand these perspectives. I also talked a little bit about another example of when people are trying to diversify data sets, how they do it, right? So I think a lot of people in the computer vision industry have now gotten the message that you need to have more diverse data sets to avoid having high disparities in error rates. But the way in which you diversify these data sets can have numerous negative consequences for many groups of people. In this case, Zimbabwean faces were being harvested without their consent, and Zimbabweans didn't really This is not the thing that is something that was, to their benefit, and their faces were being collected without their consent. So, to recap, sometimes you need to make sure that there aren't disparate error rates across subgroups. So if we were to do something like melanoma detection, we want to make sure that this melanoma detector works for people in every gender, age, geographic location, skin type, etc. But then sometimes the test just should not exist. So one example is automatic gender recognition. And then sometimes the manner in which the tool is used is very problematic, because who has the power? And most of the time here it's data and ability to train powerful models versus who is subjected to those models. And I do a lot of work on face recognition, but right now, especially given the protests and what's happening to my community, to the Black community, it's very timely to talk about it. People ask, sometimes it's not so straightforward what tasks should exist and what tasks should not exist, right? So for example, automatic gender recognition, it's very straightforward for people in the trans community because they're directly harmed by it to say that this is a task that's harmful to them. But somebody who has never been harmed by those kinds of systems might not have the same perspective. And again, in face recognition, people ask, why should we care about face recognition? What's the problem? Because people recognize faces, right? And so my point is that technology does, it just amplifies our intent. So if our intent is to discriminate against people, technology can really amplify that, right? So this example was an example of in a magazine that was trying to educate people in the US how to distinguish between Chinese people and Japanese people. This was during World War II. And the point being that we should, target Japanese people, but not Chinese people. And so now this is being done at a really large scale, right? So you have people being targeted, Muslim minorities being targeted in China, and we have many Black people being targeted in the US. 1 in 2 American adults is in a face detection database, in a face recognition network. And most of the people who are targeted are Black and brown neighborhoods, as we can see in the protests right now. I gave in the first part of this lecture an example of Baltimore police, for example, during the Freddie Gray protests, using face recognition on protesters, trying to match it to their social media profiles, and then targeting those people for other arrests. So this is what I mean by who has data and power and who doesn't. So this, I recommend for people to read this report, this perpetual lineup report from Georgetown Law, and a follow-up report, America Under Watch. And I also talked about the fact that there is a very almost no intersection between the people who advocate for these technologies and sell them to tech companies and benefit from it and get rich and famous or get tenure or whatever it is, and academics versus the people who are actually harmed by this technology, which is in many places Black and brown people, and in the US and in Europe. And I mean, I was saying, I had a podcast where I gave a message about recent events that racism is a global phenomenon. It just depends on how it manifests itself. And of course, in different places, there are different kinds of dimensions along which people are marginalized. So I do believe that in our research, we cannot ignore social and structural problems, which is why I co-founded Black in AI, along with my colleague Khalid Abeba. And this organization, I give other examples in the past, in the last lecture, but this organization, one of the things that I'm happy about is that people who almost wanted to leave, who almost left the tech industry because of marginalization, who stayed because we gave them support, subsequently did lots of important work showing biases in face recognition tools, for example, that are used by law enforcement, that are sold by Amazon to law enforcement. And one of these people is Deborah Raji. And then, of course, in our quest to address ethics and fairness, which are now everybody's now talking about it, we just can't have that without representation. I mean, we've understood this in our data sets, and now we haven't, though, transferred it to the people, right? The people protesting outside in the US are Black people, and the people who have shown the disparities in error rates on face recognition are Black people. The people who are disproportionately being affected are Black people, but we don't see them in leadership positions or being represented in all of these ethics or other kinds of panels or platforms. So that was just a brief recap of all the things that could happen, and many of them are rooted in society and data. And data is basically supposed to reflect society. This paper from Ken Holstein and his collaborators at Microsoft Research says, while fair ML, so they did a surveys of industry professionals, practitioners, to ask them what they need in kind of working on fairness in machine learning. And they said, while the fair ML literature has largely focused on debiasing methods and viewed the training data as fixed, most of our interviewees report that their teams consider data collection rather than model development as the most important place to intervene. And so we need a whole specialty in machine learning just dealing with data. We don't teach that in classes. Even when you're publishing in conferences, there's always like this kind of inferiority about writing a data set paper. It's not really respected very much, and most people, a lot of reviewers will write, oh, this is just a data set paper. I mean, even recently we had to say something when people were talking about breakthroughs in machine learning, and they got rid of, they didn't have ImageNet in the timeline as a breakthrough. So there's this attitude that data is just something that's just given to you, and you should just work on interesting algorithms using this data as a benchmark. But actually, the most important part of this whole thing is data, and how we represent the world in this data, and how we collect this data, and whose data is being represented in what way. And we don't really, we don't respect that type of work, and we're not training anybody in our field to respect this kind of work. And so in this paper called Lessons from Archives, Strategies for Socio-Technical Machine Learning, Ansu Zhou, who is a PhD student, a history PhD student at Stanford University, and I talk about some ways in which, for example, the archives, we can learn from history. Because archives they're just the oldest field that deals with human-centric data. And so they have very rigorous processes for dealing with data. And I think I've tried to kind of really quickly discuss many of the issues that have to do with data that are complex. So that's consent. So for example, I gave the example of Flickr, right? Sure, the license allows you to use this data, but did people really think that this data was going to be used in that way when they put it out there? Power, which is who has the power to use this data and who doesn't, and who's benefiting from collecting data on whom. Inclusivity is how people are represented in their actual data set, and who is represented in the data set. Same with representation. Subgroup classification and annotation, again, like how do you define different subgroups? So in our work on gender shades, we talked about skin type, and we talked about gender, but there are so many different subgroups. And how do you do this annotation? How do you do this classification? Of course, privacy and ethics, and transparency. So how do you convey the motivation of creating this data, and the manner in which it was created, and the kind of like tools to help people reproduce this process anyways. So one quote that's really important, again, is to remember that data sets involve subjects and objects, and many times humans. And as computer vision researchers, we kind of tend to forget that. We kind of reduce humans to numbers. And so I want to highlight again this project called Our Data Bodies Project. And I really like this project because it's one of the few projects that specifically aligns itself with people from marginalized groups, right? Their day-to-day activity, their day-to-day conversation is with people in marginalized groups. Whereas many researchers and many practitioners, we're not paid by people in marginalized groups. We don't really present our work, we're not promoted, or advanced because of our relationship to people in marginalized groups. But on the other hand, this happens for us because of our relationship to power. So our incentive structures are very different. So in the project, they say why we're concerned about data. And they say many things about, database technologies are changing our lives, but they say this work is important because our data is our stories. When our data is manipulated, distorted, stolen, or misused, our communities are stifled and our ability to prosper decreases. So Sita Peña Gangadharan is one of the people who is involved in this project, and she gave this keynote at iClear that I recommend everybody watches. And she says, people are caught in a never-ending cycle of disadvantage based on data that was collected on them. So she gives a few examples of stories. One is, Jill says, I pled guilty to worthless checks in 2003, 15 years ago, but this is still being held against me. All of my jobs have been temporary positions, because she gets a job and then if they find out about this, then she might lose her job, right? Or she won't get a job because of this. Is this really fair? And no matter what kind of fair machine learning we create, is this practice fair? And then Sita talks about refusal. People refuse to settle for the data-driven systems, process of data collection systems that were handed to them. So Mello fought tooth and nail to find housing. She was repeatedly denied housing, had witnessed the death of her friend, had witnessed all sorts of atrocities. And she had a sense that this was why she was being denied housing. And each time she reapplied for housing, she was denied. So she challenged the data that was used to categorize her as someone who who does not need housing or should be denied housing. And another example is Ken, a Native American man who deliberately misrepresented himself so that the police couldn't find his name in a database. And so they issued him a ticket without a surname. Ken was practicing refusal against database-dependent police practices. Sita, ironically, she came to, she was very heavily involved in a conference that I'm involved in called FACT. And we created this conference, it's called, FACT stands for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency in Socio-Technical Systems. And this conference was created it's an interdisciplinary conference in computing. So it was created with the understanding that we cannot really address these issues of fairness, accountability, and transparency in a manner without being interdisciplinary. And so this conference was specifically targeted at working on this problem in an interdisciplinary way. And Sita came and she said, I've heard computer scientists present their research in relation to real-world problems as if computer scientists and their research is not done in the real world. I listened to papers that tended to disappear people into mathematical equations. Marginalized people are demonized, deprived. What's the point of making data-driven systems fairer if they're going to make institutions colder and more punitive? So in our technical world, a lot of times we just kind of abstract away the real world, and then we try to figure out how to make some abstracted thing fairer and using some metric. But we don't really think about the manners in which these data-driven systems are used in our work, right? So I gave a few examples of people in marginalized groups, and many times these people in marginalized groups are demonized, like Sita says, right? They are kind of the stories that are told about them, like the stories that are being told about people protesting right now, are by the people who have power are very different. So for example, the late Toni Morrison says, I admire the patience that people have had for so long. They were waiting for justice for so long, and they didn't loot for so long. No one talks about that. Whereas you watch TV and they talk about looting, property damage, and that's the thing that's considered crime. But the injustices that have happened in the US and around the world against Black lives are not really the things that have been considered crime. And so again, marginalized people are demonized. So again, we need to have an interdisciplinary approach specifically focused on data because it is the point of entry into many of these systems. So I highly recommend this article by Ali Al-Khatib. Talks about how we can learn from anthropology. But we will really quickly talk about archives. And so archives are the oldest attempt to gather human data, right? And so there are many different kinds of archives. They are supposed to be a balanced and representative record. And they have institutional missions and agenda. So there are private archives like the Rockefeller Archives and public ones like the UN. And so for example, the State Department has a bunch of archives. There's the Internet Archive that's trying to archive the Internet right now, which is actually, you would think that because we're in a time where there's so much information that there is no archiving, it wouldn't be a problem. But the thing is, it's not being done in a systematic way, so actually historians are worried about how the current time in history is being archived. So we think of, we kind of have this arrow, and we think of two ends of the spectrum. One is the Wild Wild West, and one is curational data collection. The Wild Wild West for us is where we currently are in large-scale machine learning, computer vision, is basically try to ingest as much data as you can. And then curational data collections is the other end of the spectrum from archives. And so we're not saying that either end is the best, but we're saying that we should understand that there is a spectrum, and that we should move towards a more interventionist curational data collection end. So what's the difference between archives and machine learning? Well, in the Wild Wild West section, there's a poor supervision of data collection and handling, right? You're doing this just so that you can get to the point of making your algorithms, and we're not spending we spend the minimum amount of time that we can on data. Whereas in archives, they have full-time curators looking at each document, thinking about whether it should be put in the archive or not. And the objectives are different, right? In our world where it's very commercial, research, and it's just move fast and break things. You want to move as fast as you can. And in archives, you want to preserve heritage and memory. The audience is very different. Archives is a limited scholarly audience, and then the Wild Wild West spectrum, we have a wider consumer audience. And the feedback is very fast for the, we want fast, we want to go to market really fast. And in curational data collections, it's very, very slow. And then of course, in the Wild Wild West spectrum, we want to basically replicate natural data, which means we want to ingest as much data representing the world in its natural form as possible, but that replicates societal biases. And then in archives, it's catered and carefully considered, but it's politically biased by the curator's agenda and initiatives. But what we'd like to argue is that even in our case, it is biased by our agenda and initiatives. It's just that we don't really acknowledge our agenda and initiatives. So we call the Wild Wild West spectrum laissez-faire, and the other spectrum interventionist. And our argument is that we should move more towards an interventionist spectrum. So what does this interventionist spectrum look like? What is the process of archival data collection look like? It goes from macro to micro. So they have a mission statement, first of all. Before anything is done, there's first a mission statement about what data you want to collect. And then there's a collection development policy that follows this mission statement. Then there is an appraisal process that happens for each document, appraising whether or not it should be part of the archives. And then each document is processed. So there's a macro big picture first, and then there is a micro plan that is created based on this macro big picture. So this is just sort of summarizing this from our paper. And so again, mission statement is the high-level agenda for asking, why are we collecting this data? And then the collection development policy is a policy on how to collect this data, right? A written policy, how to collect this data. And the appraisal is, so for each sources. Is this source worth collecting? Why? Does it fit the mission statement? And then the processing is basically whatever processing needs to be done for each source. So I just wanted to highlight a few shared concerns between archives and kind of machine learning, computer vision, the kinds of conversations we're having right now. We talk about, issues with people's data, and people's data are people's stories and how they reinforce cultural stereotypes. And this is kind of what people in archives also talked about and wrote about. People also talk about, who determines the status, who determines what story to tell when you're gathering data archives, when you're curating an archive. So who is the curator? Like Mimi said earlier, right? There's always the subject and the object. So who is the person doing the collecting, and who is the data being collected about, and how are they being represented? So some other kind of things to think about with respect to archives that are very useful and for our purposes are things that they have developed to address some of the issues related to data. So one example is power. Like I said, there is a power imbalance on who has data on whom, right? So one example, one understanding is that right now people have cell phones, right? And so people with cell phones could videotape injustices that are happening to them. But if they didn't have cell phones and only the police had cell phones, then you couldn't do this kind of videotaping. Right now, there are large institutions with power that have data, and the average person doesn't have this kind of the data on the large institutions like that the large institutions have on the average person. So in order to kind of increase a little bit of power and join forces and pool resources, archives have data consortiums. And I have actually heard people talk about, suggest data consortiums in in machine learning as well. I know that this kind of discussion has happened in the EU. So they could pool resources and maybe maximize their collection, maximize their geographical cover. And so why this is, I think, a very useful thing to think about, because, for example, on the news, I heard when GDPR, so the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU came out, that the stock prices of large companies like Facebook and Google went up, and those for smaller companies went down, because large companies have the resources and the infrastructure to comply, and smaller companies don't, right? Like when you talk about having this kind of rigorous data collection and annotation practices, having rigorous testing practices, it's very difficult for smaller companies to do that. So maybe having some sort of a data consortium could help with that. Another issue is representation. So I gave an example of how people in the trans community, for example, talk about how gender recognition tools should just not exist. And that's not the only example, right? There are many cases in which, and I gave many stories from our Data Bodies project, where data was being collected about people, and it kind of was preventing them from getting resources because the data that was collected about them was from the perspective of someone with higher power. And so how can you create a data set where the data set that's being collected about a particular community and how that particular community is represented is determined by that particular community? So for example, in archives, and in anthropology, there's been many issues where people from a particular dominant group, for example, like in colonization, anthropologists would go to people, indigenous groups of people, and quote unquote study them and do all sorts of experiments and gather all sorts of data, but the data that's being gathered and the way in which they're representing them is not the way in which these people want to be represented. So there are tools, like for example, Mukurtu is a tool that allow people in Native, for example, in the US, Native Americans, to archive their own cultures in a manner that they see fit. So they manage their digital cultural heritage in a manner that they see fit, using their own protocols. So in our cases, a lot of times we use crowdsourcing, for example, to gather and annotate data. So is there a way, instead of telling people to, I don't know, label some images, this, or like something binary like this or that, is there a way we can allow for open-ended ways of labeling so that people can label themselves in a manner that they see fit? Another interesting one is code of conduct. So, I mean, a lot of companies have AI principles now. Stanford has AI principles. Institutions have principles. There's a partnership in AI that's formed. But the question is that are any of these codes of conduct are they doing anything? Does anybody feel the need to comply? Like, do they have to comply? What is the incentive? What is the enforcement strategy? In archives, it's I just want to add that, I don't think I have slides here. I thought I did, but anyways, in archives, first of all, each person is a full-time data collector. So remember, there are people whose full-time job is to collect data, and then they have to be members of their each of these councils that we were talking about. So you are a member as an individual of a particular institution that has its own code of ethics. And if you violate that code of ethics, you might have to be told to leave. And this is different from the code of ethics for the institution that you're working in, right? So personally, you're a member of some outside institution, and then you're working at a specific internal institution that might have its own internal ethics. And then there's a cross-institutional kind of arrangement where there is a code of ethics for each institution as well. So there's 3 layers here by which you have to comply. I think we have to think about this kind of stuff in our field to see how we can enforce various incentives and various codes of ethics. Again, this is just to explain that there are entire books and studies on how to select and appraise manuscripts. So for each manuscript, what process to go by in order to determine whether or not this manuscript should be created. So here is an example. There are guidelines for writing an appraisal report. So here is an example. First you want to write the background and information. So name of agency, creating this data set. Type of agency, what's the annual budget, what's the number of employees. Here is an example of what an appraisal report looks like. And what really struck me is that this is very close to what we proposed in Datasheets for Datasets. We just didn't know that these things existed in archives already. Archives basically already have datasheets. So this work was we recommended it because my prior background was hardware, electronics, and I saw that in electronics, for every component, there was a data sheet that kind of discussed all of the tests that were done on this component, and what the tolerance level is, what it should and should not be used, etc., etc. And so we were saying that all data sheets should be accompanied by data sets with such information, not only after the fact, after the data set is collected, but during the data set collection process, that people should fill this out, because it helps them. It's like a workflow. It's like I think of it like the appraisal guideline, right? It's how to write, how to create, how to annotate, what process to go through to collect a data set. So one example is, for example, in gender shades, we have, when we have different kinds of data sets that have to do with humans, do we talk about what the distribution of age is, skin types, geography, gender, etc.? So this is an example of what I said in electronics, right? So you can see that there's a data sheet for this, this is a capacitor. For this component. And so this data sheet talks about all of the tests that was done on this component. And so a similar thing that we proposed, again, a sister to Datasheets, is model cards, where you again, each model is accompanied by a model card where we do these tests. So you can see, for example, after like a long time, we got Google to have model cards. So Meg Mitchell, my co-lead, is the person who was driving this. And so this is an example for like an object detection model at Google, where the model card is publicly available. It talks about different kinds of evaluations that were done on the data, on different kinds of data sets, etc. So this is the way in which we think the direction in which we think the field should move. Again, finally, there is cultural and demographic surveys and guidelines in archives. So, for example, one example is when we're looking at data sets, right? I think in computer vision or in NLP or something like that, we're driven by what's available. So let's use Reddit, right? People are going, let's use Reddit. But what analysis is done on the kinds of, if you have a mission statement of why you're collecting this data, you look at Reddit and you can analyze what kind of people are writing on Reddit and who is kind of left out. So in our paper, we do a case study, right? Like people from rural areas, for example. If you were looking at a language model for a specific language like English, there are certain kinds of ways in which it's spoken that's not represented on Reddit. It's overwhelmingly male. So then if you had a collection development policy that identifies these kinds of things, then you can have a separate kind of process that also gathers data outside of Reddit, trying to address these issues or at least understand the limitations. So in this section, I want to conclude this section saying that societal biases enter when we do so many things, starting from when we formulate what problems to work on, and that is determined by the people involved in this field. And so if that group is already very homogeneous, we have no kind of hope for fairness, right? Then there's collecting, training, and evaluation data, which is a lot. And then there is architecting our models and loss functions. And then there's analyzing how our models are used in society. What does it mean that something works versus not? Who gets to decide that, right? So people in the Black community don't think face recognition is working for them. Protesters don't think face recognition is working for them. The people involved in our data bodies don't think that the ways in which data sets are being collected about them are working for them. But although all of these other things are involved, our papers, classes, and incentive structures, they only focus on this one thing, which is architecting our models and loss functions. So what I'd like us to move towards is a much more holistic understanding of what we're working towards and not have this really narrow view of what our field should focus on. And so again, I think the whole point here is that we need to learn from other disciplines who have looked at data much more rigorously and work with them to draw lessons from machine learning. So for those of you who are going to watch our tutorial, Emily is going to discuss another line of work on data ethics. For those of you at the workshop, thank you, and I hope you also watch our tutorial. Thanks.